I knew he was going to go on vacation for a week, and so about a week later I went back to John. I said, I think I want to speak on the book of Esther. And John said, boy, can you do that in 1 week? And I said, no. Can I have 6 or 8 weeks? And we talked about it a little bit. We worked out a compromise. I came down, and he came up, and we settled at 2. And so then about 3 weeks ago, I went back to John a second time, and I said, John, there is so much good stuff in Esther. Can I have a 3rd week? And he hesitated a little bit, and yet I have to say that he was very gracious, and he said, okay, you can have that 3rd week. I do have to mow his lawn all summer for him, but other than that. But anyway, we're going to take 3 weeks. Part of John's hesitancy here, let's just say this, I hope you hear me. He's a little bit concerned that people might perceive him as shirking his responsibility here, being in the pulpit every Sunday. And so cut him some slack. John, he's an amazing pastor.
Amen.
He is so busy. You probably don't recognize how busy he is. He does men's Bible study on Wednesday. That's prep time for that. I know he spends probably at least 20 hours a week on his messages on Sunday morning. He does adult Sunday school prior to that. He's done a men's retreat just 2 weeks ago where he spoke 3 times. He's done 3 or 4 funerals in the last month or 6 weeks. And then the meetings with elders concerning phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Plus somewhere there he has to figure out how to find time to be a husband and a father. And so I know he's looking forward and enjoying his little bit of time off right now, and he'll come back in a couple weeks being really refreshed. So please understand that too, okay? Thank you. The book of Esther. Boy, what an amazing story. I know you've probably read this maybe many times, but you're familiar with the story of Esther. It's one of those stories, Hollywood would be hard pressed to come up with a better story than the book of Esther. And the story about Esther, that's true, so it's even better than what Hollywood could come up with. It's, on one hand, you have the evil intentions of wicked man trying to go up against a sovereign God. And who do you think is going to win that one? The story of Esther begins in... Oh, by the way, there are notes there in your bulletin. We will be reading some verses through the first 3 chapters this morning, but they will not be up on the wall. But take that Bible there in the pew pocket and turn to Esther right now, and just kind of keep your finger there. We will be referencing some of those verses. We'll be reading them word for word in just a little bit. And you can kind of follow along as we work through the first 3 chapters today. I meant to mention that earlier. The story of Esther begins in the year 483 BC. But before we really get into the story, I want to give us a timeline here of chronological order of events that were going on prior to that time. Because without that understanding, it can be kind of confusing. And the reason I say that is that the book of Esther comes after Ezra and Nehemiah. But the events in Esther actually take place about 30 to 40 years earlier. The book of Daniel comes much later in the Old Testament. And yet Daniel takes place about 100 to 120 years before Esther. And so the books in the Bible are not all in chronological order. And if you understand that timeline here, it'll make us all come together in a better way. Maybe this will help. This should be up on the wall. Brian, you have this. And if you remember, it was the year 930 BC. Israel divided into a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. The northern kingdom was called Israel. The southern kingdom was called Judah. That happened in 930 BC. In 722 BC, the northern kingdom, being Israel, they fell to the Assyrians. Judah, the southern kingdom, kind of held on for another 117 years. But then in 605 BC, they began to fall to Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. That was the first wave of attack from Babylon in 605. A second wave of attack came in 597, an attack on Jerusalem. And then the third attack, which came in 586, completely destroyed Jerusalem as a city, destroyed the temple, and then they took the rest of the Jewish exiles into captivity. About 40-some years later, in 539, Babylon is overthrown by King Cyrus and the Persians. And then exactly just 1 year later, King Cyrus, actually he was rather wise in some of his decisions. I wouldn't say everything, but at least this one. 1 year later, in 538, he allows about 50,000 exiled Jews to return to Jerusalem. And that was a good PR move for the king. That made the other Israelites, the other Jews were pleased with that. It helped him out, his status with other people when he allowed them to do that. About 2 years later, in 536, those 50,000 Jews in Jerusalem began to rebuild the temple. It took them 20 years, but they completed that in 516 BC. A few years later, in 492, King Darius is now king of the Persian Empire, and he attacks Greece, and we'll get to that in just a few moments. 6 years later, in 486, Darius' son Xerxes becomes king of Persia. And then we have the story of Esther, which begins in 483. It runs for about 10 years' time, and it concludes about 473. And then 15 years after that, we have Ezra, the priest, returns to Jerusalem. And then 13 years after that, Nehemiah returns to Jerusalem under the commissioning from Artaxerxes, which was Xerxes' son, who is now king of Persia. Nehemiah goes in 445 back to Jerusalem and rebuilds the wall. And how many years did it take him to rebuild the wall?
52 days.
How many years?
52 days.
52 days, yeah, exactly. Good job, Toby. 52 days, they rebuilt the entire wall around Jerusalem. Amazing, amazing. It was a miracle. Certainly God's hand was on them during that time, building that wall in such a short period of time. And then 330 BC, Persia falls to the Greeks and Alexander the Great. And so the reign of the Persians ends at that point. So now we come to chapter 1 of Esther. And like I said, it begins in 483 BC. Xerxes has now been the king of the Persian Empire for about 3 years. And there's an ongoing conflict with Greece that his father Darius had started about 8 years earlier. The Greeks ruled a smaller portion of the world in comparison to what the Persians had. It was a very small area. The Persians ruled most of the known world at that time. And actually everything as far east as India, and then as far west as Ethiopia and into Egypt. That was a lot of territory. But you know, like it is with most kings probably, most is not enough. Greed comes in. And if I own 90% of the world, I want that 10% that I don't quite own yet. And that was the way it was with Xerxes, and obviously his father Darius also. They wanted what they didn't have yet. They wanted even more. And that's the way it always is with greed. Patty and I were in Spokane just 3 or 4 weeks ago watching 2 of our grandchildren. And little Johnny's about 1.5 years. His sister Amelia is 3. Johnny had a ball. And he was playing with that ball. Amelia had a ball also, and she was having a good time with that one ball that she had. At that moment, she was content with just one ball. But Johnny wanted both of them. He didn't want to give up the one he had, but he wanted the one that his sister had also. And so he was trying to figure out, how am I going to take this away from my sister who's bigger, older, that kind of thing. So anyway, greed. Whether you're 1 year old or 91, we all can struggle with greed and discontent. I think someone asked the old man, billionaire Rockefeller, one of the wealthiest men in the world at the time. They asked him, how much money is enough? And you know what his answer was? Just a little bit more. I mean, he had more money than his family could ever spend, but just a little bit more. Greedy. You know, I could do a whole message on that if I had more time. If I just had 4 weeks instead of 3, I could do that.
That's greed, isn't it?
Yeah. So back to Esther. 9 years earlier, Xerxes' father, Darius, had started this onslaught against Greece. Now, this is not the same Darius and the same Xerxes that we see in the book of Daniel. Same name, but different men. And Darius has attacked Greece, and he lost badly in a battle at Marathon. If you know your history, the Greeks were badly outnumbered, greatly outnumbered, but they won a stunning victory at the Battle of Marathon. And according to history, that prompted a soldier/messenger, a man named Phidippides, to run what was at that time the world's first ever marathon. He ran the 26.2 miles from the battlefield at Marathon. He ran back to Athens to report to the people of Athens their stunning victory over the many Persians. And he did that without any proper training, I'm sure. And the history says that he got to got to Athens, and he no more than got those words out of his mouth that we won, but that he dropped dead right there on the spot. Unfortunately, he probably didn't get to pick up the T-shirt that he was going to get for finishing that run. But he died right there on the spot. Chapter 1 begins here with Xerxes wanting to drum up more support for the next attack on Greece. And so chapter 1 starts out where Xerxes is hosting for 180 days, bringing in officials from all 127 provinces in the Persian Empire, bringing in people of authority, all the governors and the mayors and people of prominence, into Susa, which is the capital of the Persian Empire at the time. And so he brings all these people in for 180 days, for half a year, for 6 months straight, just to show off his wealth, show off his splendor, to impress them with how much he had. Now, he's not the first king that has ever done that. You remember that King Solomon did that many years before and showed off the wealth that he had to the Queen of Sheba. And then a few generations later, King Hezekiah did the very same thing to the Babylonians. Brought them in and showed them the wealth of Jerusalem, which ended up being a really bad decision, because in 605 they fell to the Babylonians. But Xerxes does this for 180 days. And then after that, he hosts a 7-day banquet. And during that 7 days, he wants to finally nail down the allegiance of all these different provinces for their support during this upcoming war with Greece. That 7-day banquet really is not much more than just a 7-day drunk. It's pretty apparent in the book of Esther that Xerxes had a drinking problem. He loved his wine. And it shows up here right in the very first chapter. It says on the 7th day that Xerxes was in high spirits from too much wine. And so he comes up with this brainy, brilliant idea that he's going to have his Queen Vashti, come in and show off her beauty to all the men who were there, who were getting drunk along with him. Well, there's a couple problems with that. Queen Vashti was obviously a very beautiful woman. The Bible says that she was beautiful. But there was also a Persian law that said it was unlawful, it was forbidden for men to look at the face of a royal woman. And so this word goes to Vashti to come before the king and show off in front of all the men. Well, she turns him down. she turns him down without explanation. And but we know that it was against law for men to look at a woman of royal position like that. It was a stupid demand on the part of the king to put that to his wife, and yet it was very risky on her part to turn down the king's demand also. So Vashti says, no, I won't do it. And very likely also, we don't know for sure, but very likely Vashti at that time was pregnant with Xerxes' son, Artaxerxes. And if she was pregnant, she probably wasn't feeling all that glamorous right at the moment. Ladies, some of you probably have not felt all that glamorous during the last part of your pregnancies. And so she didn't feel like she wanted to parade in front of a bunch of men anyway. Plus the fact that it was against law. And so she does not come before the king. Well then, of course, he is very, very angry over that. And he seeks the counsel of some of his wise men. The Bible said that they were studiers of the times. They understood the times, which meant that they were astrologers. And so Xerxes asked these advisors, what should I do? And they all come back and say, well, you're going to have to remove her from position. Take her out of office. Because if she stays in office, her defiance is going to encourage other women to do the same with their husbands. And we certainly can't have that. And so Xerxes follows that advice. Vashti is removed from her royal position as queen. You know, it was a dangerous position, dangerous decision on Vashti's part to turn him down, but it was also a stupid demand of Xerxes regarding his wife. I could do a whole message on that if I had 6 or 8 weeks. But, Xerxes obviously did not have a clue as to what his wife, her greatest need would be. There's a pastor down in Gresham, Oregon, a man named Stu Weber. He's a pastor of the Good Samaritan Community Church. At least this was 30 years ago. I don't know if he's still there now or not. But 30 years ago, he was a pastor in Gresham, Oregon. And he wrote a book called Tender Warrior. It's a book for men, about men, how to be both tender and how to be a warrior at the same time. It's an oxymoron, but men, we can be both. We can both be tender, we can both be tender and ferocious. We can be men that are warriors, protectors, but we can also be tender. And God has called us to be both. And in that book, Stu Weber says that a woman's greatest need is to know that she is protected and cherished by her husband. And when a wife knows that she is protected and cherished by her husband, she in turn will gladly, willingly meet her husband's greatest need, which is to know that he is loved and respected by his wife. And folks, it's not really rocket science. It's not beyond our capability to understand, and yet many of us miss it. We all do. Patty and I do it at times, and I know some of you have done it also. But what it really comes down to is putting your spouse's needs and wishes and desires ahead of your own. And the more often we do that, marriage will just be, it'll be like this. It'll just fit together so nicely because we are meeting the needs of each other. Well, obviously back to Xerxes, he never read the book Tender Warrior. He never went through the seminar called Love and Respect. And so Xerxes doesn't have a clue. Now we move to chapter 2. And chapter 2 starts out with the word later. And in some translations it might say after these things. And that means actually that there's about 3 or 4 years of time that went by between the end of chapter 1 and the beginning of chapter 2. And we know from history, not necessarily from the Bible, but from recorded history, that during that 3 or 4 year period of time, Persia went to war again, a second time, with Greece. And Xerxes wins a battle at the Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BC. Well then, 1 year later, Persia suffers a major defeat at the Battle of Salamis. when about 300 of their ships are destroyed. Now about this time, apparently Greece is starting to get tired of Athens' ongoing assaults on them. And so at that point, Greece takes the offensive. And they turn on Persia. And they decide, okay, we're going to fight you with fire. And so in about 2 years' time, Greece annihilates almost the entire military, the ground forces and the naval forces of Persia. Just wipes them out. And it's amazing because the Persian army was probably 10 times the size of the Grecian army. And yet the Greeks were far, far better trained in combat. And so they destroy Persia. And that pretty well stops all of the war for a long period of time. In chapter 2, Xerxes realizes that he needs a new queen. Queen Vashti has been removed several years before, but she hasn't been replaced with a new queen yet. And so Xerxes comes up with a plan to go through the entire Persian Empire and gather up hundreds of young, beautiful women, all virgins, and bring them to Susa, where the palace was, and then prepare them over a 1 year period of time to individually meet with the king and go through a job interview where you can figure out what the job interview is going to consist of. And they each have their opportunity to impress the king. And of course the one who impresses the most will then become the new queen. And so he goes around through the entire empire and gathers up all these hundreds of women. Now on the surface, for a young woman, beautiful, virgin woman, it might have been flattering to even be considered to be in the running for a position of queen. It might be kind of like the Miss America pageant, where you have 50 contestants, one woman becomes Miss America, but the other 49 all come out with something. They either get college scholarships, or they get job offers, they get interviews, they get endorsements, they get something. And so every one of those 50 come back with more than what they had going in. They all come out winners in some way. But not so much in Persia. In Persia, obviously there would be one winner, she would become the queen, but then for the hundreds of losers, they couldn't go back home. They would be gathered up and taken to the palace in quarters there called the harem. And from that moment on, for years and years and years, until their appeal was probably run out, they would become part of the king's concubine. They would be removed from their families, they would be forced into restricted living quarters, and living a life of boredom and doing nothing but just maybe waiting for the king at any moment to say, yes, you come to me tonight. And that's all they had to, that was their life from that moment on. And Xerxes had enough concubine to allow him a different woman every single night of the year if he chose. You know, the Bible says that King Solomon was the wisest man who ever lived. And yet Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines. That doesn't sound like wise to me. Men, how many of you would like to have 700 wives?
No.
No.
How they do this to kill you.
Not a good choice. But anyway, that's what Xerxes did. Now essentially the whole process of this going before the queen, or going before the king, was coming down to how beautiful the woman could look, how well she could please the king. That was pretty much the entire job interview. So now we see in chapter 2, God's divine providence. So we're going to talk about that a lot over the next 3 weeks. God's divine providence starts to take place in the story of Esther. That's the main theme of the book. Even though God's name is not even mentioned in the 10 chapters of Esther, we see his handprint. We see his presence in every single chapter all the way through the story of Esther. Webster's dictionary defines providence, and this should be on your notes. Webster's dictionary defines providence this way: the foreseeing care and guidance of God or nature. Well, let's trim that down just a little bit. Since God is sovereign, which means that there is no one above God, God is God, and since God created everything there ever has been, including nature, since God controls everything, including nature, then let's just bring this down and say that providence is God's foreseeing care and guidance, period. Leave the nature part out of it.
Yeah.
Dr. David Jeremiah says that divine providence refers to a sovereign God orchestrating the affairs of humanity by direct and indirect intervention and arrangement. And that's exactly what we see here in Esther. Evil man trying his very best to control history, but he's going up with his own evil plans against the sovereign God. And God is essentially saying, no, not so fast. I'm in control, not you. And so we have one more description here of divine providence. This one's from J. Vernon McGee. This is my favorite one. Divine providence means that the hand of God is in the glove of human events. The hand of God is in the glove of human events. You take a glove and toss it on the table and stand back and watch it. That glove is not going to move. It won't do a single thing until you slide your hand inside that glove. And that's the way it is with human events. Nothing will happen at all until God slides his hand into that glove of human events. Oftentimes he allows us to choose our own way. And that's why we get in trouble so often. But when God has his hand in there and he's controlling, he's orchestrating the affairs of humanity in a way of divine providence, it's a joy. In chapter 2, Esther is one of the women that has been rounded up by the king's order. And we don't know, but she may be the only Jewish woman out of all the women who are rounded up and taken to the palace. Let's look at a few verses here now in chapter 2. I'm going to read chapter 2, verses 5 through 7. If you have that Bible there, you can follow along. It says, "Now there was in the citadel of Susa, or the capital, a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin, named Mordecai, son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, who had been carried off into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, among those taken captive with Jehoiakim, king of Judah." This is back in 597. Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her mother and father died. Mordecai and Esther are both Jews. Mordecai's great-grandparents were probably part of the exiles, or those deported from Jerusalem in 597 during that second assault from Babylon. They were upper middle class, and so they would have been taken to Persia in about 597 at that time. That would have been Mordecai's great-grandparents. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, others would have been taken during that first one in 605 because they were upper class in status. So both Mordecai and Esther are born, obviously, in Persia. Now back to the women. They've all been housed, they've been gathered up by the king. They are in Susa, in that area right there, right near the palace. They are being housed in a place called the harem. And none of these women will even see the king for at least a year, some of them more than that. And they will spend a year in preparation for that one night appearance before the king. The king's eunuch, a guy named Haggai, was in charge of all these women, of prepping them for 12 months with beauty treatments and special food. They probably didn't have liposuction, but they probably would rub them down and fluff them up and get them looking as good as they possibly could for the king. Because no king would ever want an ugly queen. And so that was the job of Haggai, was to get these ladies all ready one at a time for their time with the king. That was essentially the whole job interview. Whoever could best please the king would become the next queen. All the others would be forced into that concubine status. They had no choice. They had no say in it. Jennifer. But it doesn't say much for the integrity and the character of a king, does it? When he devalues a woman so greatly. But sadly, ladies, 2,000, 2,500 years ago, women didn't have much value. And they weren't much more than just property. So it was a sad period of time, but it went on for a long, long time. So we know that Esther does become the queen. And as the rest of the story is told, we see clearly that God's divine providence is in the story of Esther. It plays out on each page. Even though God's name is not found on the pages, His presence is there time and time again. Esther is exactly the right choice for queen because she is God's choice. She follows Mordecai's instructions as to not giving her nationality. Don't let anybody know that you are a Jew at this time. We'll keep that quiet for now. Now is not the right time to bring that up. Later on will be, but not right now. So she doesn't tell the queen or the king or anybody else that she is a Jew. Mordecai, obviously, is a Jew. He's also a low-level official of some kind, which probably means that he was a judge. Because in chapter 2 there, it says that he is outside the king's gate every day, gate leading into the palace area. And Mordecai is there every day. And he overhears at some point two men talking there at the king's gate. Let's look at chapter 2, verses 21 to 23. During that time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers, who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. But Mordecai found out about the plot, and he told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. And when the report was investigated and found to be true, the two officials were impaled on poles. All this was recorded in the book of the annals in the presence of the king. So here's these two men. They are mad at the king about something. We don't know what, but they want to kill him. And so they're plotting and planning how we're going to do this. And Mordecai overhears this plan. And he goes and tells Esther. She tells the king, and then also tells the king, now this word is coming by way of Mordecai. And so you might want to thank him at some point. Well, these two men, they go through a quick trial and they are impaled. We'll talk about that next week. That was gruesome. That was plain horrible. But anyway, we'll look at that next week. But anyway, but Mordecai is not thanked. He kind of falls behind through the cracks of the floor or something like that. Anyway, he doesn't get thanked at that point. That shows up later on. Chapter 3. Chapter 3 introduces the enemy. Many of Hollywood's great stories always have a villain or an enemy in the story. And Esther has a villain here in chapter 3, a man named Haman. Chapter 3 begins with, after these events. Now this means that there's also another period of time that goes by between chapters 2 and chapter 3. Esther had now been queen for about 5 years. Let's look at chapter 3, verses 1 to 6. We get introduced to Haman. After these events, King Xerxes honored Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor higher than that of all the other nobles. All the royal officials of the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. Then the royal officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's command?" Day after day they spoke to him, but he refused to comply. Therefore they told Haman about it to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated, for he had told them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. Yet, having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all of Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. Haman was about as vile as a man can be. He is arrogant, self-absorbed, prideful, evil to the core, consumed with hatred and driven by power. The well-known saying that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, well, that was Haman. It fits him to a T. But here, every day, Haman goes by the king's gate, and there's one man who will not bow down before his feet and honor him, and that is Mordecai. And I think we know why. Mordecai is a Jew, and Mordecai obviously is willing enough to serve under a pagan king, much like what Daniel did 120 years earlier. He can do that much. But Mordecai is saying, I'm not going to bow down to any man. I will not compromise my integrity by worshiping a mere man. Only God is going to get my worship. And so Mordecai refuses, even under the king's order, to bow down to Haman. Haman has demanded subservience from everyone, and the king has even put his stamp on that, literally with the signet ring, saying in an edict that everyone will bow down to Haman and give him honor and respect. Well, Mordecai is not giving it. Mordecai obviously believes in a sovereign God who one day will deliver the Jews from captivity. Now remember that they are in the Persian Empire. Even though the Jews have some liberty, they can own a business, they can live pretty much peacefully in a foreign land. Even though they are still captive, they still have some of that leeway. But they are not free. They're not in their own land. And so they are still captive in a foreign country. And Mordecai and Esther both know of God's divine providence that says all throughout the Old Testament that God will always, always, always preserve a remnant of his people. Those who are faithful to him. And it comes down to the matter of faith. We've been reading in Wednesday morning men's Bible study for the last year about the Israelites and how God always kept a remnant of those who were faithful. Many of them were destroyed. Many of them died off. But God always preserved a remnant of the Jewish people. And Esther and Mordecai both know that. And we see this playing out even more next week in chapter 4. So Haman learns that Mordecai, he finds out that he's a Jew, and his hatred intensifies. It just goes through the ceiling. Not only now does he want to destroy Mordecai, but he wants to destroy the entire Jewish people. I mean, after all, why kill just one man when you can wipe out an entire nation of people and become rich at the same time with all the plunder? And that's what Haman's thinking. I can really benefit myself by this. I can satisfy my anger, my bitterness, my hatred towards Mordecai and the Jews. I can become rich at the same time. Now here's the situation. Mordecai is from the tribe of Benjamin, and he was a direct descendant of Kish. Kish was the father of King Saul. Saul was obviously a Benjaminite. Haman was a descendant of the king Agag of the Amalekites. The Amalekites were the very first enemy to attack the Israelites when they came out of Egypt. They'd barely gotten out of Egypt when the Amalekites first attacked them. The Amalekites were not much more than just a roving band of guerrilla terrorists. they feasted off of other people by killing them and taking their plunder, and then taking some of their people. That's what they lived for. That's what they were. They were not much more than just ancient thugs. In 1 Samuel chapter 15, verses 1 to 3, God tells King Saul to totally destroy King Agag and the Amalekites in battle. Don't leave anyone or anything alive. Destroy them completely. God knew that the Israelites would never be able to live peacefully in the Promised Land as long as the Amalekites and other enemies were still there in existence, as long as they allowed them to live. He knew that their corrupt, idolatrous, religious practices would always contaminate the Israelites and would affect their relationship with Almighty God. And so the only way for the Israelites' bodies and souls to be saved and to prosper was to utterly destroy the enemy and all their possessions, including their idols. Well, Saul does defeat the Amalekites soundly in battle, but he doesn't destroy them. What Saul probably thought was a great victory, God no doubt looked at as a bitter defeat because Saul disobeyed. In fact, it was Samuel who actually ends up killing King Agag, not Saul. And so over the years and the generations to follow, the Amalekites continued to be an enemy to the Israelites for many centuries, as well as influencing the Israelites with their idol worship. Let's look at a few more verses here in chapter 3. Chapter 3, verses 7 through 11. In the 12th year of King Xerxes, in the first month, the month of Nisan, the pur, that is, the lot, was cast in the presence of Haman to select a day and month. And the lot fell on the 12th month, the month of Adar. Then Haman said to King Xerxes, "There is a certain people dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from those of all the other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will give 10,000 talents of silver to the king's administrators for the royal treasury." So the king took his signet ring from his finger and gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. "Keep the money," the king says to Haman, "and do with the people as you please." So Haman, he cast what's called a pur, P-U-R, which is what we would call today casting lots. It'd be kind of like rolling dice. It was not a gambling type of thing, but it was to make the decisions, the decision-making tool. There were probably some stones that were painted, or maybe some blocks of wood that had little markings on them, and they would cast those onto the ground, and they would read from that what they should do. The Persians were very superstitious. They had many gods, and so they wanted to cast lots to see what their decisions should be. And that's exactly what Haman does here. Today we use much more dignified methods, such as drawing straws, or eeny, meeny, miny, moe, or maybe rock, paper, scissors, that kind of thing. But Haman doesn't know that the queen Esther is a Jew, nor does King Xerxes. Neither one of them have found that out yet. And so Haman is promising 10,000 talents of silver to go into the king's treasury. Folks, that's a lot of silver. 10,000 talents was about 375 tons of silver. Whoa. That would probably pretty well replenish the king's treasury that had been depleted from all those wars with Greece. And the king is obviously quite pleased about this money he's going to be receiving, because it says here at the end of the chapter that they sit down and they drink together, kind of a celebration of what's about to happen. The king is obviously far more pleased with the money that's going to come in than he is upset or sad about the tens of thousands of Jewish lives that are going to be slaughtered by Haman. That didn't bother him. Just a few years earlier in war, he lost hundreds of thousands, maybe 1 million or more soldiers and sailors in the battles with Greece. And that didn't change him. He was still the miserable man that he was. He's probably a lot like what King Jong-un of North Korea is. Except that Xerxes probably had a better haircut. But Xerxes was unpredictable. He was dangerous. He was moody. Probably had a drinking problem. He was a king with vast wealth and even greater power, but very little integrity or conscience, and probably even less common sense. He was certainly a pagan king. Folks, we're almost out of time. Let's wrap up chapter 3 here, and then in a few moments we'll move into a time of communion. Reading the last part of chapter 3, beginning with verse 12. So they passed this lot, and they determined that the day of Mordecai's demise, the day that the Jews will be all slaughtered, is on the 13th day of the first month. In verse 12 it says, on the 13th day of the first month, the royal secretaries were summoned. Now it comes out that this was done in about what we would view today as April. It would be the first month of their calendar year when the lot was cast. And it came up that the 12th month would be the day of slaughter. And so that was 11 months away, which would make it about February or March in our calendar today. So Haman was going to have to wait 11 months before this all takes place. Verse 12. Then on the 13th day of the first month, the royal secretaries were summoned. They wrote out in the script of each province and in the language of each people all Haman's orders to the king's satraps, the governors, the various provinces, and the nobles of the various people. They were written in the name of King Xerxes himself and sealed with his own ring. Dispatches were sent by the couriers to all the king's provinces with an order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. A copy of the text of the edict was also issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality so that they would be ready for that day. The couriers went out, spurred by the king's command, and the edict was issued in the citadel of Susa. The king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was bewildered. Obviously, not everybody understood. Only 2 men were really happy about it, and they were celebrating with more wine. But here the day is set, the judgment day is set for about 11 months away for Mordecai and the entire Jewish nation to be slaughtered, needlessly, senselessly, all because of one man's deep-seated hatred, bitterness, and anger towards the Jewish people. It all comes down to his power. We're going to move into communion time in just a moment here. I want to invite you to come up. Before we do that, I'm going to give you just a little bit of an assignment for next week. Don't worry, there won't be a test that goes with this, but your assignment will be to read the book of Esther sometime this week. It'll take you no more than about 35 to 40 minutes to read all the way through Esther. Maybe 4 or 5 minutes a day we'll do that. And then so you come next week with just a good picture of the story of Esther and God's divine providence and how he takes care of his people. You know, we were talking about his divine providence, how God orchestrates humanity by direct and indirect means, how God's hand is in the glove of human events. And I think probably the greatest example ever of God's divine providence is when he sent his son, Jesus, to earth. You know, he came as a baby. He came as a Messiah that very, 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 very few people recognized. They were looking for the kind of Messiah that Jesus was. And so they were all disillusioned. They were looking for a warrior. They were looking for a king who would deliver the Jews at that time from the captivity by the Romans. And so they were looking for a king who would lead them into battle, literally, and free them from that captivity. And of course, Jesus wasn't that kind of Messiah. He came to free us from a greater bondage that we have, and that's the sin we have in our lives. And in the book of Acts, Acts chapter 2, this is right after Jesus has ascended into heaven. Peter is addressing a crowd. And Peter says this in Acts chapter 2, verses 22, 23, and 24. I'll read this to you. Fellow Israelites, listen to this. Jesus of Nazareth was a man accredited by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs, which God did among you through him, as you yourselves know. This man was handed over to you by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge, and you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him to a cross. But God raised him from the dead, freeing him from the agony of death, because it was impossible for death to keep its hold on him. That's divine providence. That's God orchestrating, telling man, you can't do what you think you want to do if I say otherwise. God is in control. He allowed his son to be put to death by a mere man, by you and by me, essentially. Our sin put Jesus on that cross. But that was all part of God's divine plan. That was set in place before the beginning of the world. It wasn't something that God had to keep changing as men did different things, and God would have to come up with a different plan of some kind to kind of counteract that. But God's plan right from the very beginning was that man was going to need a Savior. And his son would be the only one who could ever be that kind of Savior. Amen. Because he was without sin. And so we come to the Lord's table this morning, as we do every month. A reminder again of what Jesus' sacrifice means to us. There's bread here that signifies the tearing of his body. There is some juice here that we will drink that signifies the blood that he shed. And he did that for you, and he did it for me. And I think when we really look at that seriously, and when we see what it cost him his own son. And he did it for you, and he did it for me. That's that amazing love we've been singing about this morning.
Amen.
The love of God that stretches farther than man could ever see. If the oceans were full of ink and the sky was a parchment, even that wouldn't be enough to write about the beauty of our God.
Amen.
We're going to have communion. Gentlemen, you come up here in front, and I think today we'll have you just stay where you are, and the men will come and serve you where you're seated. Okay? Would you pray with me? Heavenly Father, we just thank you for being our God. Father, we thank you that you love us in a way that we can never, ever match, return to you that same kind of measure of love. We thank you that you chose to give your Son sacrificially so that we may have an opportunity to live with you forever and ever. That Jesus took the punishment that we deserved, and he rose again. He's alive today. And Father, by being your adopted children, by giving our lives to you in a matter of trust and faith and surrender, Lord, we know that we belong to you, that nothing can ever, ever, ever pluck us out of your hand. And Lord, the promise is that one day when this life is over, we will spend an eternity with you. And Father, for that we are so forever thankful. Father, as we take these elements right now, may it once again remind us of the severe cost that it was to your Son. Father, we thank you for that. We pray in your name. Amen. just remembered this just now, this very moment. The man who wrote, I don't remember his name even, but he wrote this song. He was offered like $1 million by someone secular if they would allow him, or if he would allow them to take that melody and use it for another song of some kind. And he said, no way.
Amen.
What a wonderful Savior we have. You know, just before he died, his body was terribly torn apart. We know about that. And this little wafer that we're going to take right now just signifies the beating that he took because he loved us so much. And then this also signifies the blood that was shed. The Old Testament says that without the shedding of blood, there was no remission of sin. And that was just an ongoing thing you had to do over and over and over and over again, just for the remission of sin. But when Jesus shed his blood, that was for once and for all. Amen. We are forever forgiven of our sin. Now, when we sin, we need to confess that for relationship purposes. But our sin has been forgiven by our Savior. And he did that up for you and for me. Father, we thank you again. We thank you continuously for your love. A love that we can never match. A love that we can never return to you in that same measure. But Father, we thank you. We praise you. In your name we pray. Amen. Amen. We have one chorus song.
You'd stand and sing with me, Because He Lives.
Downstairs, as we always do, so we'd love to have you downstairs with a little more time of fellowship, coffee, and refreshments. Thank you. Have a great day.